Hello everyone, welcome to the course Second Language Learning. For today's lecture, the topic is observing second language learning and teaching. In this lecture, I will focus on describing different contexts of language acquisition. I will also introduce two approaches that are used to observe second language acquisition and teaching practice in the classroom context. Specifically, in the first part of the lecture, I will describe the second language acquisition context by comparing two settings, natural setting and instructional setting. For the instructional setting, I will also describe two types of settings that are organized based on language instructions, which include structure-based instruction and communicative instruction. To give you more detailed description of classroom setting, I will also compare characteristics of two typical classrooms, such as English as a second language versus English as a foreign language, and English intensive versus English immersion. In the second part of the lecture, I will describe why it is important to observe the classroom, what can classroom observation offer to understand second language learning and teaching, and finally, I will describe methods of classroom observation that are commonly used. They are classroom observation scheme and ethnography. Okay, let's start with the language acquisition context. In research, it can be assumed that there are two generally settings for second language acquisition. The first setting is the natural setting, and the second one is the instructional setting. So what do we mean by the natural setting? The natural setting can refer to the context where the learners use the target language in their daily activities. They can use the target language for work or for social interaction or for studies, such as in the content-based schools. Meanwhile, the instructional context refers to the context where the language is taught purposefully. In this sense, activities that learners take part in are pedagogical rather than real-world. However, it should be noted that the distinction is not always clear-cut, because there are situations where the context is both natural and pedagogical. It means it is a mixture of both natural setting and classroom setting or instructional setting. I have just distinguished between two settings of second language acquisition. Now let's have a closer look at the characteristics of each setting. One of the first characteristics of the natural setting is that language is presented holistically for the purpose of communication. Given its purpose of communication, errors are rarely corrected if the conversation goes smoothly. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of using a target language in a natural setting is to communicate, so meaning is paramount. Within this natural setting, learners are also immersed with the target language, and these encounters with the target language are real-life interactions that happen in different situations or events. Since the interactions are real-life interactions, learners have an opportunity to expose to a variety of language events through dialogic conversations. Now let's move to the characteristics of the second setting, which is the instructional setting. As I mentioned earlier, in this context, language is purposefully taught. For this context, researchers further classify it into two main subcontexts depending on the teaching methodologies that are used. They include structure-based setting and communicative setting. For the structure-based setting, usually grammar translation method is used. However, for the communicative setting, the content-based or the task-based language teaching approach is often used. The main difference between these two settings is that for the structure-based context, learners learn the language through acquiring the grammatical rules, that is the system, the language system, and the vocabulary. However, In the communicative context, learners learn the language through interaction and language use. Despite the difference, both settings share the same goal, that is, learners learn the language itself. Given the different focus of structure-based and communicative teaching approaches, each teaching context therefore features different characteristics. To provide you with a more comprehensive description of each setting, I will present some key ideas about each setting. For example, for structure-based instruction, linguistic items are presented and practiced separately. Teachers focus on correcting learners' errors very often. Thus, error correction occurs frequently in this setting. In addition, in this context, teachers is often the only input of the target language, who would pressure learners to produce language. The language discourse types are also limited in this context. At times, a native language is probably used apart from the teachers' and learners' shared first language. Meanwhile, the communicative context features different characteristics as compared with the structure-based context. Because the focus of communicative approach is to promote communication, in the communicative context, amount of error correction is quite limited. Therefore, learners have less pressure to be always accurate during communication. Also, the meaning of conversation will be emphasized instead of the language form. In addition, although teacher can be the input provider, peers also provide input to each other. Besides, given the purpose of encouraging communication, this communicative context provides a variety of discourse types where learners can be exposed to use of language in different situations. In some cases, the input is modified in order to enhance communication. In other words, input can be simplified for the purpose of effective communication. So I have just presented some key ideas about the structure-based and communicative contexts. Before I move on, I should note this. Please keep in mind that the general description of classroom settings that I have presented above can give a general idea of what each language acquisition is like. However, it cannot show the individual characteristics of the classroom. Each context may have other characteristics depending, for example, on learners, teachers, and the teaching approaches that are used. So, when you are looking at each language acquisition context, it is important to take these factors into account. Now I will move to compare some specific classroom settings. In order to help you understand how classroom settings are organized, I will present a rough comparison of classroom settings across contexts. The first comparison is between the ESL English as a second language and EFL English as a foreign language. And the second comparison is between English intensive and English immersion. The first comparison I would like to demonstrate is between ESL and EFL contexts. Some of you may have heard about these contexts, so in this part, I just briefly specify some major differences between them. So first, if we compare two settings, ESL and EFL, we can see that often in the ESL context, the learners are heterogeneous. This is a mixture of learners probably coming from different parts of the world, speaking different languages and of different age. Meanwhile, in the EFL setting, learners are homogeneous. They are often of the similar age, sharing the same first language. Another difference between ESL and EFL setting is the teacher's use of language in the classroom. For example, in the ESL setting, teacher may not speak any foreign languages, so he or she must speak in the learner's target language at all times. Meanwhile, in the EFL setting, the teacher may share the same first language with the learners, so he or she is likely to speak the first language of learners. The next difference between these two contexts is the discourse and the teaching materials that are introduced to the learners. In the EFL setting, teachers often have to teach according to the curriculum, which is regulated by a high office in a country, such as Ministry of Education. So the teaching materials that are used must comply with these high office regulations. That is, the materials must be taken from a textbook, and at times they can use materials from the internet. But with this constraint, the teachers tend to have less emphasis on types of discourses that are introduced to the learners. Meanwhile, in the ESL setting, the teachers are often free to choose materials from different sources. The materials can be from the newspapers, radio broadcasts, or from any other authentic material sources. As a result, the teacher can provide different useful discourse types. Now I will present another comparison between intensive English and English immersion settings. It can be said that the main aim of intensive English program is to help learners to learn English, whereas the main aim of English immersion is to educate learners about the different subject matters. With the difference in terms of aims, for English immersion program, there is no real focus on accuracy. Meanwhile, for the intensive English program, there may be a bit more focus on accuracy. However, it's still very limited. In addition, for the English immersion program, academic language is used in order to teach different subject matters, whereas in the English intensive, the focus is on everyday language for communication purposes. It should be noted that these comparisons are not absolute. That is, there are cases where there can be a mixture of both settings, so it is better to keep that in mind. So up to this point, I have just presented only some major characteristics of each setting. Of course, you can add more characteristics to this if you can think of any. Just to summarize what has been presented in this part of the lecture, I have just described two learning contexts, the natural context and the instructional context or the classroom context. I also provided some key ideas about characteristics of two subcategories of the instructional context based on two types of instruction, the instructed-based approach and the communicative-based approach. Besides, I also provided a brief comparison of ESL and EFL learning contexts and the intensive English and English immersion learning contexts. I hope the description of language acquisition context will help you to understand more about each learning context and will be able to tell the similarities and differences between them. So this is the end of the first part of the lecture. In the second part of the lecture, I will focus on classroom observation and the approaches that I use to observe classroom. Thank you for your listening.